You're with Julian, Mad for It, and Oasis is Shite, and how Oasis ruined British music. Back in the 80s, after the sort of post-punk era of a lot of sort of new wave and new romantic and synth pop, there emerged this wave of still iconic British indie bands that became globally prominent. Smiths, New Order, Depeche Mode, The Cure. And what was interesting about that period is they weren't part of the scene. They existed in their own holistic bubbles. They didn't really engender other bands to be like them at that point. They existed in a netherworld of the mainstream pop music, and obviously they're the high point of that kind of alternative music at the time, and America didn't really have that kind of alternative music. Not that crossed over as much. They had people like Husker Du or Sonic Youth, but they were still very alternative. Whereas we were watching the Smiths and the Cure and so on top of the pops. And it was the golden era for those individual acts, but there was no scenes. And when the Smiths died, probably the kings of indie music at that point, they engendered this horrific era of C86, which is this very sort of twee trite music with none of the virtuosity of Johnny Marr's grandiose compositions, none of Morrissey's incredible lyrics, and just a whiny sort of I want this girlfriend sort of music. Sarah Records era of travesties and war crimes against music. And English music on the indie side was dead for a few years, and it kind of came to a rebirth in the very late, probably 1989. And some bands started to move through at the same time as the Pixies were getting very big in the UK. There were acts in the UK that were getting a lot of attention for making music that wasn't particularly connected with those titans of alternative music like Depeche Mode or New Order or The Cure or the Smiths. It was a new wave of stuff like The House of Love, like My Bloody Valentine, and no doubt the kings of this era, Creation Records, who had a roster of virtually everything that was happening for a few years. Now, this was the best era for British music since the late 1960s. Since the Beatles' Help and that era where there was a dozen different interesting UK acts that have remained culturally significant ever since and very sort of influential. Small Faces, Rolling Stones, and a million blues-infected acts from the Yardbirds to Blind Faith and Cream and God knows how many dozens of other acts. But this wasn't just down to rock music. This era from 1989 was completely across the spectrum. So we had on the techno house, hardcore, big beat side of things, we had acts like Orbital and Underworld and Left Field and The Prodigy and Chemical Brothers coming through and making dance music, not a 12-inch that someone else played, but album length properties, and then playing at festivals, playing live concerts. It was a huge deal, one of the biggest moment I think in electronic music history, and people will say no way, because this was probably mainly a white British thing, which people are very uncomfortable about. They want to go back to the era of techno in Detroit or house in Chicago and say it's a black thing. But I think that moving this music into an album format and into the live arena was an even bigger deal. We had trip hop, we had the era of, Tricky, Massive Attack and Portishead and everything they spawned. We had shoegaze, my own personal favourite, with My Bloody Valentine and Slow Dive and Ride and God knows how many others, but those three pivotal acts, which are still going to this day now, were all on Creation Records, as were Primal Scream. We had Manchester, which was, you know, the Stone Roses and the Happy Mondays and the Mad for It sort of era. All of this was happening at the same time. And at the same time, another analogous to Manchester movement was starting to ferment, and it would be the poison that would taint and destroy this British music, and it was called Britpop. And I've spoken before about how there are certain styles of music I just don't go back to. Like I said, in the past, I don't really go back and listen to Nevermind by Nirvana, but I will listen to Siamese Dream by the Smashing Pumpkins, and I will listen to Sugar, Copper Blue every year. But there's a part of grunge I just don't go back to, maybe because it was overdone and didn't die out fast enough, whereas shoegaze was killed by the British music press and then re-emerged. And there was, amongst this Britpop thing, it was started kind of, I believe, by the Lars. Their self-titled debut album and masterpiece was probably the first true Britpop album. And then we had the Stone Roses in the Manchester scene kind of fomenting that same deal, and also Suede, who were even more a Britpop album, and the debut album by Suede and their early era was phenomenally good. I've got the album on vinyl and all of the singles and 12s from that era up until their second album, Dog Man Star. And they were phenomenal, and they were again a bridging point. They were kind of against the likes of shoegaze, and they were very much, you know, we're going to dress smart and we're going to be big stars. But the Stone Roses were the pivotal act. They're the ones that said, I want to be adored. And they did it as a Faustian pact. I don't have to sell my soul. He's already in me. They're the ones that actually made this treaty where post-Smiths music, it was a crime to be popular. And they said, fuck you, we're going to be the biggest band in the world. And we all know what happened to Stone Roses, which was they were the best of all of us, and certainly the best post-Smiths British indie guitar band. And then we're on the sidelines for 5 years fighting legal battles and so on. And into this mix came another Creation Records band, Oasis. And Oasis took that template of wanting to have that chord change brilliance and songwriting brilliance of the Smiths combined with the attitude of the Stone Roses, with none of the skill or lyricism of either band. The Stone Roses, Oasis were these lugheads that came in with what's been called now dad rock, which is this churning, instrumentally dull music. And you only have to compare Rock and Roll Star by Oasis, their clarion call to world domination, with the Stone Roses' I Want to Be Adored, and how lyrically different those two tracks are, how one is very trite, and one only contains a few lyrics, yet says so much more. But also the instrumentation and the performances of the individual members of the Stone Roses wipe the floor with Oasis. Oasis were lugheads. Listen to a track like Waterfall from the Stone Roses, and the intricacy of the drumming and the beauty of the bass line and the guitar parts compared to really good songs by Oasis, which are just churning, and the bass and the drums are always just the most bog standard thing you can get. Now, I'm going to say Oasis were brilliant for definitely maybe What's the Story, Morning Glory, and the outtakes and B-sides, Master Plan, 3 albums that were fantastic. But they weren't in the same league as the Stone Roses on any level, and they would probably say the same, but they were very interesting because of their tabloid nature. But where they really killed that incredibly fertile period of British music was their success. They transferred into much bigger success because they were a much more easy proposition to digest. They were these heroically anthemic songs that didn't have any of the knottiness or any of the detail or any of the kind of cultural awareness. They were just like, we're going to write big songs, we're going to be the She Loves You era of the Beatles, whereas other acts were the Help or White Album era of the Beatles. They were the originators, copied at their most basic template. So I don't hate Oasis. I mean, I was a fan of them as well. I did actually see them at Glastonbury in 1995 where Robbie Williams was on stage, and I was actually backstage at that Glastonbury watching him melt down when he got sacked from Take That, and I didn't think they were that great. But yeah, their great songs were phenomenal. Even Definitely Maybe has got songs like Digby's Diner or What's the Story has got, you know, those trash songs on it. Compared to the pinnacles of the other artists around that time, they had 70% fantastic songs and, 30% chaff. It's the acts that they inspired that became dominant on the industry due to their success that killed British music at that period. We were left with these satellite properties like we were with Depeche Mode and Cure and New Order. We were left with Radiohead and Spiritualized, Swerve Driver, I can't remember the Welsh ones at the moment. I've forgotten their name, but there were these, The Verve. They were all on their own. There was no longer any scene attached to them. The scene that Oasis engendered, which was the Britpop scene, started to get a lot of acts that were like Sleeper, and Gene, which were also ran acts at any point, but they were actually the high point of what would follow, which is landfill indie, which is the inevitable outgrow of Britpop, which is, bands like Keane, The Editors, Maximo Park, Kasabian, Baby Shambles, Glas Vegas, The Kooks. All these bands came along with one or two songs that were terrific, but nothing instrumentally interesting about them, and a couple of albums worth of detritus. And it kind of destroyed British indie music. So that's why I'm saying that they killed British music, because it was the most incredible scene of multiple genres for a while, and then it homogenized around this one band, who after What's the Story and the Master Plan became Shite for many years. Absolute garbage. And that's why they killed British music. But am I mad for it? I am, actually. To be honest, the timing of this has been perfect. I think a lot of people just found it very, very exciting for our Oasis to come back at this moment. I've mentioned I just did a Jack White review about how suddenly I'm thinking about a White Stripes reunion. And I think part of it is that we don't have any bands anymore. The music festival is dead. I didn't even bother watching on YouTube. I usually watch Glastonbury or Coachella. And the last few years it's just been these insanely tepid pop acts that get lionised even by people like Pitchfork magazine, who just mime to backing tracks. And the music's shite. It's rubbish. And there are no bands, but there are, I've said over and over, British indie music with its jangly, angular, post-punk bands that have come through, like the sadly no longer Black Midi or Black Country New Road. And there's probably about 5 or 6 incredible indie bands, but they're not aiming for global success. Their music's too knotty and too difficult, but they have been fantastic. But when it comes to festivals, there's just no, we're watching Coldplay for the 5th time at Glastonbury, and probably next year's it will be the Foo Fighters on his Made Up to My Wife tour. So people are longing for bands, and I think this whole Oasis thing, where we've got personality-free music now. We've got music that's based on TikTok, and we've got music that is trying to fit into a social paradigm, and then you've got Oasis coming along and being unmanageable and rude, and that's what we expect rock and roll to be. We don't expect rock and roll to fit into these paradigms, and I think that's what's taken over music, is that a lot of sort of like my side, the left side, used to be on the outer, and there seems to be some level of control over what artists can get away with now. They have to be apologetic if they've done something wrong, and then Oasis come on, and Noel and Liam are very much not apologetic, and it gives rise to the notion of bands coming back. So I am completely for the Oasis reunion, and they were brilliant at a time, and if they don't touch albums like Be Here Now on when they're doing their reunion tours, it might be a fantastic experience. But also because it kind of brings a bit more excitement back into the arena of bands playing large festivals, instead of it being a pop act, a female solo pop act headlining Glastonbury that just isn't that interesting, that doesn't have that catalogue of songs, that is largely playing to a backing track, that has augmented live vocals, and doesn't have that much personality. So they did kill British music, but maybe Oasis can bring back the band